The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat quietly in her private study. Her delicate fingers traced the edges of a letter she had been writing for weeks, each word carefully chosen, each sentence carrying the weight of everything she could no longer say aloud. The room, normally filled with the cheerful chatter of her children's voices echoing from the garden, felt unusually silent today. William had left early for a series of royal engagements, kissing her forehead gently as she pretended to sleep. She had felt his lips linger there longer than usual, as if he somehow sensed what she couldn't bring herself to tell him. The chemotherapy treatments had been harder than expected, and the latest scan results sat folded in her desk drawer like a secret she wasn't ready to share with the world. Kate rose from her chair slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. The elegant cream-colored dress she wore hung looser than it had months ago, but she had learned to disguise the changes with expert tailoring and strategic accessories. The public still saw the radiant princess they expected to see, the woman who smiled warmly at charity events and waved gracefully from balconies. They didn't see the woman who sometimes gripped the bathroom sink at 3 a.m, fighting waves of nausea that medication couldn't quite control. The letter in her hands represented months of struggle with words that felt impossible to write. How do you tell the man you love, the future king, the father of your children, that the future you had planned together was slipping away like sand through fingers? How do you explain that the woman who had once been so strong, so certain of her place in this complicated world of protocol and duty, now felt as fragile as ancient parchment? She walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens where George, Charlotte, and Louis had spent countless hours playing. The climbing frame William had insisted on installing despite the security concerns still stood there, slightly weathered now, but sturdy. She could almost hear their laughter carried on the autumn breeze, could almost see William chasing them around the oak trees, his tie loosened, and his usually perfect hair disheveled from their games. Those moments had been precious beyond measure. In a life carefully choreographed by centuries of tradition, those unguarded hours in the garden had been their sanctuary. No cameras, no schedules, no expectations except to be a family. William would scoop up Louis and spin him around until the little boy shrieked with delight, while Charlotte organized elaborate tea parties for her dolls, and George practiced his football skills with determined concentration. Kate remembered the day she had first felt something wasn't right. It was during a state dinner at Buckingham Palace, one of those glittering affairs where every smile was scrutinized and every gesture analyzed by the press. She had been standing beside William, listening to a visiting dignitary discuss agricultural policies, when suddenly, the room seemed to tilt slightly. The chandelier lights became too bright, the conversation too loud, and she had to excuse herself quietly to the powder room. William had found her there 10 minutes later, concern creasing his features as he knelt beside her chair. "Are you all right?" he had asked, his formal royal bearing completely abandoned as he became simply a worried husband. She had smiled and blamed it on the heat, the heavy gown, the long day. He had accepted her explanation because he trusted her completely, because in their marriage built on mutual respect and genuine affection, deception had never been necessary. But that night had been the beginning of a series of small lies, tiny omissions that grew larger over time. The fatigue she blamed on busy schedules, the weight loss she attributed to stress, the occasional dizzy spells she dismissed as consequences of skipping meals. Each excuse had been believable because they all contained elements of truth. Royal life was exhausting, stressful, demanding in ways that outsiders could never fully understand. The diagnosis had come on a Tuesday afternoon in March. She had driven herself to the private clinic in Harley Street, telling her protection officers that she was visiting a friend. The oncologist, a kind man with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had delivered the news with professional compassion but unmistakable clarity. The words had hit her like physical blows, aggressive, advanced, limited options. She had sat in her car in the clinic parking garage for nearly an hour afterward, staring at nothing, trying to process information that seemed to belong to someone else's life. This happened to other people, not to princesses who ate organic vegetables and exercised regularly and had access to the best medical care in the world. Not to mothers of 3 young children who still had birthday parties to plan and school plays to attend. The decision to keep the diagnosis private, at least initially, had been instinctive rather than calculated. She needed time to understand what they were facing before sharing it with William, before watching his world collapse the way hers had in that sterile clinic room. She told herself she was protecting him, giving him a few more weeks of normalcy before everything changed forever. But as the weeks turned into months and the treatments began taking their toll, the secret became a weight that threatened to crush her. Every morning when William asked how she was feeling, every evening when he rubbed her shoulders after long days of public appearances, every night when he held her close and whispered about their future plans, the truth sat between them like an invisible wall. The children had been easier to shield, their natural self-absorption providing cover for her increasing absences. Nanny had taken on additional responsibilities without question, and Kate had restructured her schedule to ensure she was always present for the important moments. School pickup, bedtime stories, weekend family adventures. These became her priorities while everything else fell to trusted staff members who assumed she was simply being more selective about her commitments. William had noticed changes, of course. He wasn't blind or insensitive, and they had been together long enough that he could read her moods and energy levels like weather patterns. But his concerns manifested as increased attentiveness rather than suspicion. He brought her tea without being asked, suggested quiet evenings at home instead of social obligations, and made sure she had extra time to rest between engagements. His kindness made the deception even more painful. Every gesture of love felt like a betrayal of his trust. Every moment of tenderness highlighted how much she was stealing from him by keeping the truth to herself. She was denying him the chance to fight alongside her, to research treatments and seek second opinions, and hold her hand during the worst moments. She was robbing him of precious time to prepare for a future that might be very different from what they had imagined. The letter had begun as an attempt to find the right words for a conversation she knew she had to have. But as days turned into weeks, the written words had become easier than spoken ones. On paper, she could craft explanations that made sense, could organize her thoughts without being interrupted by a shock or pain or desperate questions about treatments and timelines. Now, holding the completed letter in hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain steady, Kate knew the time for secrecy had passed. The latest test results made it clear that her condition was progressing faster than the doctors had hoped. The treatment options were becoming more limited, more aggressive, more uncertain in their outcomes. William deserved to know not just about her illness, but about how far it had already advanced while he remained unaware. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope bearing his name in her familiar handwriting. The words inside contained everything she couldn't say out loud. Her love for him that transcended duty or title, her gratitude for the life they had built together, her hopes for their children's future even if she couldn't be there to see it unfold. But, most importantly, the letter contained an apology for carrying this burden alone when it should have been shared between them from the beginning. The sound of cars in the palace courtyard announced William's early return from his engagements. Kate had expected him to be gone until evening, but some instinct must have called him home. She heard his familiar footsteps in the corridor, the brief exchange with staff members, the slight pause outside her study door as he decided whether to interrupt her private time. Kate. His voice carried the particular mix of formality and intimacy that characterized their public-private existence. Even when they were alone, they remained aware of staff members who might overhear, of children who might be listening, of the constant need to maintain dignity while expressing genuine affection. "Come in," she called, quickly placing the envelope on her desk and turning toward the door with what she hoped was a natural smile. William entered the room with the easy confidence that came from years of royal training, but Kate could see the concern in his eyes immediately. He had developed an instinct for reading her emotional state, and something in her voice or posture had triggered his protective instincts. "You look tired," he said gently, crossing the room to stand beside her chair. "How are you feeling?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with months of unspoken truth. Kate felt the weight of the envelope behind her, felt the pressure of secrets that had grown too large to contain. This was the moment when everything would change, when their carefully constructed normalcy would shatter like crystal hitting stone. "William," she began, then stopped as her voice caught. The word carried so much more than his name. It held all her love, all her regret, all her fear about what came next. He knelt beside her chair immediately, taking her hands in his with the instinctive tenderness that had characterized their relationship from the very beginning. His hands were warm and strong, hands that had comforted her through difficult times, hands that had held their children moments after birth, hands that would soon tremble as they held the letter that would change everything. "Whatever it is," he said softly, We'll face it together. You know that, don't you? The simple certainty in his voice nearly broke her resolve. This was William at his most essential, not the future king or the public figure, but the man who had chosen to build a life with her despite all the complications that choice entailed. He loved her completely and trusted her absolutely, and she was about to destroy that trust with revelations that would alter the foundation of everything they had built together. Kate looked into his eyes, those familiar blue eyes that had watched her walk down the aisle of Westminster Abbey. That had been the first thing she saw when she woke up after giving birth to each of their children, that had looked at her with such pride during countless public appearances when she managed to navigate some particularly tricky aspect of royal protocol. Those eyes would look different after today. They would hold knowledge that couldn't be unknown, pain that couldn't be unfelt, fear about a future that suddenly seemed uncertain in ways they had never imagined. She was about to hand him a burden that would change not just how he saw her, but how he saw everything. Their marriage, their family, his role as future king, the very trajectory of his life. "There's something I need to tell you," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "Something I should have told you months ago." She reached behind her for the envelope, her movements slow and deliberate, giving him these last few seconds of ignorance before everything changed forever. William's face went completely still as Kate placed the envelope in his hands. The elegant cream stationery felt heavier than paper should, weighted with implications he couldn't yet grasp. His name was written across the front in Kate's familiar script, but something about the careful formation of each letter suggested this wasn't a simple note or reminder. "Kate, what is this?" His voice carried a note of uncertainty that rarely appeared in his public persona. As future king, he had been trained from childhood to project confidence even in unfamiliar situations. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that royal training couldn't prepare him for. She had withdrawn slightly in her chair, her hands now folded tightly in her lap. The afternoon light from the window caught the delicate bones of her wrists, highlighting how much weight she had lost in recent months. Details he had noticed, but attributed to stress, to the demanding schedule of royal duties, to the natural fluctuations that came with their high-pressure lifestyle. "Please read it," she said quietly. "I've been trying to find the words to tell you myself, but some things are easier to write than to say." William studied her face, searching for clues about what the letter might contain. She looked fragile in a way that went beyond physical appearance. There was something in her eyes that reminded him of broken glass, beautiful but damaged beyond simple repair. A cold understanding began to creep into his consciousness, the kind of dread that arrives before rational thought can process its implications. He opened the envelope carefully, his hands surprisingly steady despite the tremor he felt building in his chest. The letter was written on Kate's personal stationery, several pages of text in her careful handwriting. The first line hit him like a physical blow. "My dearest William, by the time you read this, you will understand why I couldn't find the courage to speak these words aloud." His eyes raced through the opening paragraph, catching fragments that made no sense individually, but were beginning to form a picture he refused to accept. Cancer. Diagnosis. Months of treatment. Advanced stage. Limited options. The words seemed to float on the page, disconnected from reality, belonging to someone else's story. Kate watched his face change as he read, saw the exact moment when comprehension replaced confusion. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his breathing became more controlled, more deliberate. She had witnessed this transformation before during moments of crisis, William retreating into the calm, analytical mindset that royal training had ingrained in him. But this wasn't a matter of state or public relations challenge. This was his wife, the mother of his children, the woman who had transformed from university girlfriend to future queen to the most important person in his private world. No amount of protocol training could prepare someone for this moment. When the single word came out strained, barely above a whisper. "March," she replied. The diagnosis came in March. William's head snapped up from the letter, his eyes wide with shock, and something that might have been betrayal. "March? Kate, it's November. You've known for 8 months, and you didn't tell me." The hurt in his voice cut through her more sharply than any physical pain she had experienced during treatment. This was the reaction she had feared most, not just the shock of her illness, but the damage to their relationship caused by her secrecy. The trust that had been fundamental to their marriage was cracking in real time. "I wanted to," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Every day, I wanted to tell you. But once the words were spoken, everything would change. And I wasn't ready for everything to change. William set the letter down on her desk with shaking hands and stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small space between her chair and the window. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, as if his body couldn't quite process the information his mind was struggling to accept. 8 months, Kate. 8 months of appointments and treatments and… God, how bad is it? What haven't you told me? His voice was rising slightly, the careful modulation slipping as emotion overwhelmed training. Kate had imagined this conversation countless times, had rehearsed various responses to his questions, but facing the reality of his pain made all her preparations seem inadequate. She had been so focused on protecting him from her illness that she hadn't fully considered how much damage her protection would cause. The letter explains everything, she said. The type of cancer, the treatments I've been receiving, the prognosis. I wrote it all down because I knew I wouldn't be able to say it clearly. William stopped pacing and stared at her with an expression she had never seen before. It was a mixture of love and anger and fear and disbelief, all fighting for dominance on features that usually maintained careful control. This was William stripped of every defense mechanism he had developed over years of public scrutiny. Don't make me read about my wife's illness in a letter, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Please, just tell me what's happening. The formal distance he maintained even in private moments had completely disappeared. This was the man who had held her hand during difficult labor, who had whispered reassurances when she felt overwhelmed by royal expectations, who had promised to love and protect her in sickness and in health. He deserved better than written explanations for something this devastating. Kate took a shaky breath and met his eyes directly. It's pancreatic cancer. Stage 3 when they found it, which means it had already spread beyond the primary site. I've been receiving chemotherapy at a private clinic in Harley Street, but the latest scans show that it's not responding as well as we had hoped. Each word felt like swallowing glass, but she forced herself to continue. The oncologist is recommending more aggressive treatment, but the success rates they're not encouraging. We're looking at months, not years. William's face went completely white. He gripped the back of a nearby chair as if the room was tilting beneath his feet. The careful composure that had been his armor since childhood crumbled entirely, leaving him looking younger and more vulnerable than she had seen him since their university days. Months, he repeated, the word hanging in the air between them like a death sentence. Kate nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. Seeing his pain made her own fear exponentially worse. She had lived with this knowledge for 8 months, had gradually adjusted to the reality of shortened time and difficult choices. But, for William, the entire devastating picture was hitting at once. Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me? The question came out broken, a plea rather than an accusation. Do you think I wouldn't have been able to handle it? Do you think I would have loved you less? The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. Kate had been so focused on sparing him suffering that she had inadvertently caused a different kind of damage, the wound that comes from being excluded from something so fundamental to both their lives. It wasn't about trust, she said quickly. It was about time. Once you knew, everything would become about the illness. Every conversation, every decision, every moment would be filtered through this knowledge. I wanted us to have a little more normal time before that happened. William shook his head slowly, as if trying to clear it of information that couldn't possibly be true. Normal time? Kate, there's nothing normal about watching your wife lose weight and cancel appointments and disappear for hours at a time. I knew something was wrong. I've been going crazy trying to figure out what I had done, what was bothering you that you couldn't share with me. The revelation that he had blamed himself for her distant behavior added another layer of guilt to Kate's already overwhelming emotional burden. In her effort to protect him from one kind of pain, she had subjected him to another, the slow torture of sensing something wrong but being unable to identify or address it. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, William. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I can see now that I was just being selfish. I was protecting myself from having to watch your world fall apart. William moved toward her suddenly, dropping to his knees beside her chair and taking her hands in his. His grip was tight, almost desperate, as if he could anchor her to life through physical contact. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, but his voice was stronger when he spoke. Our world, he corrected firmly. Not my world. Our world. This is something we should have been facing together from the beginning. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Sharing the worst things as well as the best. The truth of his words hit her with unexpected force. She had been so caught up in her role as protector that she had forgotten her equal role as partner. Marriage, especially their marriage with all its unique pressures and public scrutiny, required complete honesty to survive. By keeping this secret, she had fundamentally altered the nature of their relationship without his knowledge or consent. The children, William said suddenly, his practical mind beginning to engage with the implications. Do they know? What do we tell them? Kate shook her head. They don't know. I've been careful to maintain normal routines, to be present for the important things. Nanny has been helping more, but the children think it's because my schedule has been busier. Kate. William's voice held a note of incredulity. You've been managing chemotherapy treatments while maintaining a public schedule and taking care of 3 children? How is that even possible? She had to smile slightly at the amazement in his voice. It was so typical of William to be impressed by the logistics rather than overwhelmed by the tragedy. His mind worked systematically through problems, breaking them down into manageable components that could be addressed individually. It hasn't been easy, she admitted. The treatments are usually scheduled during the children's school hours, and I've been very careful about when I allow myself to feel sick. But it's getting harder to hide the effects. William studied her face more carefully now, seeing details that made sense in this new context. The subtle changes in her coloring, the way she held herself when she thought no one was watching, the occasional moments when her smile seemed to require visible effort. God, Kate, how many times have I asked if you were feeling all right, and you said you were fine? How many times have you smiled through feeling terrible because you didn't want me to worry? The questions weren't accusations, but they carried the weight of recognition. He was beginning to understand the scope of her deception, the daily choices to suffer alone rather than share the burden with someone who loved her enough to carry it. Every day, she said simply. Every single day for 8 months. The admission hung between them, stark and devastating in its simplicity. 8 months of mornings when she woke up afraid, of treatments that left her weak and nauseated, of scan results that brought worse news than hoped, of moments when she wanted nothing more than to collapse into his arms and let him take care of everything. William released her hands and stood again, but this time his movements were more controlled. She could see him shifting into problem-solving mode, the part of his personality that had been trained to handle crises with methodical efficiency. What do we do now, he asked. What are the next steps? Who are your doctors? What treatment options haven't been explored? Kate felt a mixture of relief and sadness at his response. Relief because he was reacting exactly as she had hoped, not with collapse or denial, but with determination to fight. Sadness because she knew he was about to discover that there weren't as many options left as he was hoping. The letter has all the medical details, she said. Dr. Harrison at the London clinic has been coordinating my care. There are some experimental treatments we could consider, but the side effects are severe and the success rates are. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I don't care about success rates right now, William said firmly. I care about trying everything possible. We have access to the best medical care in the world. We can get second opinions, third opinions, explore treatments in other countries. His voice was gaining strength as he spoke, fueled by the relief of finally having something concrete to do. This was William at his best. Faced with an impossible situation, he became more determined rather than less. It was one of the qualities that would make him a good king and made him an exceptional husband. We will fight this together, he continued. No more secrets, no more protecting each other from difficult truths. Whatever time we have, whatever treatments we try, whatever decisions we need to make, we do it all together. Promise me. Kate looked into his eyes and saw not just love, but fierce determination. This was the man who had chosen to build a life with her despite knowing that their every moment would be scrutinized by the public, who had stood beside her through the adjustment to royal life, who had supported her through 3 pregnancies under media observation. I promise, she said, meaning it completely for the first time in months. William leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, the same gesture he had made that morning when he thought she was sleeping. But now it carried different weight, not just affection, but commitment to face whatever came next as a unified team. I need to read the rest of the letter, he said. And then I need to call Dr. Harrison. And then we need to figure out how to tell the children and the family and God, Kate, there's so much to do. She could see his mind already racing ahead, organizing the chaos of this revelation into manageable tasks and decisions. It was exactly what she had needed but hadn't allowed herself to accept, a partner to share the overwhelming burden of managing illness while maintaining family and public responsibilities. William, she said as he picked up the letter again. Thank you for not hating me for keeping this secret. He looked at her with such love and sadness that she felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. I could never hate you, he said. I'm hurt that you felt you had to carry this alone, but I could never hate you for trying to protect me. That's who you are. You put everyone else's well-being before your own. The understanding in his voice was almost more than she could bear. After months of isolation and fear, the relief of sharing the burden was overwhelming. For the first time since that terrible afternoon in the oncologist's office, she wasn't facing this alone. The letter trembled in William's hands as he continued reading, each paragraph revealing layers of deception that Kate had maintained with meticulous care. The clinical details were devastating enough, the medical terminology that translated to shrinking possibilities and shortened timelines, but it was the personal revelations that truly shattered him. She had written about mornings when she barely made it through breakfast with the children before retreating to her bathroom to be violently sick. About royal engagements where she had excused herself multiple times, claiming minor issues while actually dealing with the side effects of chemotherapy that left her dizzy and nauseated. About nights when she lay awake beside him, wanting desperately to wake him and share her terror, but choosing instead to let him sleep peacefully in ignorance. You wrote about the garden party at Buckingham Palace, he said, his voice hollow with recognition. When you had to sit down during the receiving line, you told everyone you had twisted your ankle. Kate nodded, remembering that particular afternoon when the combination of treatment side effects and the pressure of maintaining her public persona had nearly overwhelmed her completely. She had managed to carry on for another hour, smiling and making conversation while fighting waves of weakness that threatened to buckle her knees. The medication makes me dizzy sometimes, she explained. I knew if I told you the truth, you would have insisted I cancel the rest of my engagements for the week. But I needed to maintain normal routines for as long as possible. William's face was a study in controlled anguish as he processed not just what she had endured, but how systematically she had hidden it from him. Every excuse now took on new meaning, every canceled plan or modified schedule revealing itself as part of an elaborate deception born of love and fear. The trip to Scotland last month, he continued, scanning through more of the letter. You said you couldn't come because of a stomach bug, but you were actually having your weekly treatment. The timing couldn't be changed, Kate said quietly. Dr. Harrison was very specific about maintaining the schedule. Missing even one session could affect the entire course of treatment. William set the letter down and buried his face in his hands. The weight of revelation was crushing, not just the medical reality, but the realization of how completely she had managed to maintain the illusion of normalcy while fighting for her life in secret. How many people know? He asked, his voice muffled by his hands. Dr. Harrison and his team. My protection officer, Thompson, because he drives me to appointments. Mrs. Williams, because she coordinates my schedule around treatments. Kate paused. And now you. The list was startlingly short, considering the magnitude of what had been hidden. 3 people outside the medical team had been trusted with information that her own husband hadn't known. The betrayal of that fact hit William like a physical blow. Thompson knows. William's head snapped up. Your protection officer knows about your cancer diagnosis, but I don't. Kate, what were you thinking? She could see the hurt transforming into anger, the kind of righteous fury that came from realizing how thoroughly he had been excluded from decisions that affected both their lives. Thompson had been with Kate for years, had protected her through countless public appearances and private family moments, but he was staff. He wasn't her husband, the father of her children, the person who had promised to stand beside her through everything life could bring. He had to know, Kate said, though she could hear how inadequate the explanation sounded. For security reasons. If something happened during a treatment, if there was an emergency, he needed to be able to communicate with the medical team. And I didn't need to know for the same reasons. If something happened at home, if you had collapsed while I was away, how was I supposed to help you if I didn't understand what was wrong? The questions were entirely logical, and Kate had no good answers for them. Every practical reason for including Thompson in her secret applied equally to William, except that telling Thompson hadn't required her to watch his world crumble. You're right, she admitted. I was being selfish. I was protecting myself from having to see you in pain, and that was wrong. William stood and walked to the window, staring out at the gardens where their children would soon be playing after school. The normalcy of that scene, the familiar landscape, the unchanged routines, seemed almost surreal given the conversation they were having. What's the prognosis? He asked without turning around. Really, Not the hopeful version you might write to spare my feelings, but the actual medical opinion about what we're facing. Kate took a careful breath. This was the hardest part, the information she had been avoiding even in her own thoughts. Without aggressive intervention, 6 to 9 months. With the experimental treatments Dr. Harrison mentioned, possibly longer, but the quality of life would be significantly affected. William's shoulders tensed at the timeline, but he didn't turn around immediately. She could see him gripping the window frame, using physical pressure to maintain emotional control. 6 to 9 months from the original diagnosis, or from now? From now. The two words fell into silence that seemed to stretch forever. Kate watched William's reflection in the window glass, saw him close his eyes, and take several deep breaths before turning back to face her. Then, we need to make some decisions very quickly, he said, his voice steady but strained. About treatment options, about the children, about your public schedule, about when and how we tell the family. She was amazed by his ability to compartmentalize devastating news into actionable items. It was exactly the response she had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. This was William functioning as the partner she needed him to be, setting aside his own shock to focus on what needed to be done. I've been thinking about all of that for months, Kate said. But I couldn't make decisions without you, which is why I kept postponing this conversation. The experimental treatment Dr. Harrison mentioned would require hospitalization for several weeks. The children would need to know something was seriously wrong. William nodded slowly, processing the implications. Their children lived under constant media scrutiny, and any significant change in Kate's routine would be noticed and analyzed. Extended absences couldn't be explained as minor illnesses or scheduling conflicts. What do you want to do about treatment? He asked. Not what you think I want to hear, not what might be best for the children or the monarchy, but what do you actually want? The question was so direct, so focused on her agency rather than external expectations, that Kate felt tears threaten for the first time since he had begun reading the letter. She had been so caught up in managing everyone else's needs that she had barely allowed herself to consider her own preferences. I don't know, she said honestly. The aggressive treatments would give us more time, but they would also mean spending most of that time sick and weak. The children would watch me deteriorate slowly instead of remembering me as I am now. William crossed the room and knelt beside her chair again, taking her hands with infinite gentleness. There's no wrong answer, he said. Whatever you decide, I'll support completely. But you don't have to decide today or even this week. We can get second opinions, talk to other specialists, explore every option. The relief of having decisions shared rather than carried alone was almost overwhelming. For months, Kate had felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Treatment versus quality time, hope versus acceptance, fighting versus letting go. Having William as a true partner in those decisions changed everything. I want to talk to the children first, she said. Before we make any treatment decisions, they deserve to know what's happening. They're old enough to understand that I'm sick, even if we don't give them all the details. William's face tightened with fresh pain. The conversation with their children would be devastating in entirely different ways than this moment with Kate. George, Charlotte, and Louis lived in a world where their biggest concerns were homework and football practice and whether they could have friends over for dinner. The concept of their mother facing a life-threatening illness would shatter their childhood in ways that couldn't be repaired. How do we tell them? He asked. George is old enough to understand more than Charlotte or Louis. Do we tell them all together or separately? Do we wait until we know more about treatment options? Kate had been wrestling with these same questions for weeks, imagining different scenarios and conversations. There was no good way to deliver this kind of news to children, no gentle approach that would make it less devastating. Together, she said. They should hear it from both of us, at the same time, so there's no confusion or secrets between them. And soon, before someone else tells them accidentally or they overhear something they shouldn't. William nodded agreement. Tonight? After dinner. Tonight. The timeline felt suddenly accelerated, as if everything was moving too quickly after months of careful delay. But Kate knew that momentum was necessary now. Every day they waited was another day of deception, another opportunity for the children to discover the truth accidentally. What about your parents? And Charles and Camilla? William was thinking through the expanding circle of people who would need to be informed, the complex choreography of family notifications that royal protocol demanded. I think we tell immediate family this week, Kate said. My parents tomorrow, your father, and Camilla the next day. Harry will need to know soon too. And your cousins. Each name on the list represented another difficult conversation, another person who would be shocked by how long she had kept this secret. But Kate felt lighter knowing that William would be beside her for all of those conversations, sharing the burden of explanation and emotional fallout. The palace will need to prepare a statement, William continued, his mind working through practical considerations. We'll need to control the narrative before the press starts speculating about your reduced schedule or appearance changes. Kate hadn't fully considered the media implications, though she should have expected William to think about them immediately. Their lives were subject to constant public scrutiny, and any significant change would be noticed and analyzed endlessly. Her illness would become a matter of international interest, with every treatment decision and public appearance dissected by strangers. Do we have to make a public announcement immediately? She asked. Can't we keep it private while we're still making treatment decisions? William shook his head gently. The press corps has already noticed that you've lost weight and canceled several engagements. If we don't control the story, they'll create their own version, and that could be much worse than the truth. The reality of their public position was reasserting itself, adding another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. They couldn't grieve privately or make medical decisions without considering how those choices would be perceived by the public they served. We'll work with the communications team to craft something appropriate, William said. Something that asks for privacy while acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. But, Kate, once this becomes public knowledge, everything changes. The media attention will be intense. She knew he was right, though the prospect of public sympathy and speculation felt almost as daunting as the illness itself. Their family's private crisis would become a matter of national concern, with every update scrutinized for signs of hope or despair. The children will need extra protection, she realized. Once the news breaks, there will be even more interest in them, more photographers trying to capture their reactions. William's jaw tightened at the thought of their children being pursued by paparazzi hungry for images of grief or fear. It was one thing to deal with routine public interest in their family life, but entirely different when that interest was focused on tragedy. We'll arrange for additional security, he said. And we'll need to talk to their schools, make sure everyone understands that this information stays private until we're ready to make it public. The conversation was becoming increasingly complex as they considered all the implications of sharing Kate's diagnosis. What had begun as a private medical crisis was expanding into a situation that would affect dozens of people and require careful management at every level. I'm scared, Kate said suddenly, the admission surprising her with its directness. William's expression softened immediately. Of the illness? Of the treatments? Of telling the children? All of it, she said. But mostly of how this changes everything for you and the children. You didn't sign up for this when you married me. William's response was swift and fierce. I signed up for you, he said. All of you, in sickness and in health, remember? This doesn't change how I feel about you, or our marriage, or our family. It changes our circumstances, but not my commitment. The certainty in his voice was exactly what Kate needed to hear, though she wasn't sure she entirely believed it yet. It was easy to make promises in the immediate shock of bad news, harder to maintain that dedication through months of difficult treatments and uncertain outcomes. What if the treatments don't work? She asked. What if we go through all of this and nothing changes? William was quiet for a long moment, considering the question she had been avoiding for months. Then, we'll have tried everything, he said finally. And we'll focus on making whatever time we have as meaningful as possible. But, Kate, we're not at that point yet. We haven't explored all the options. His optimism was genuine but tinged with desperation, the kind of hope that comes from refusing to accept unacceptable possibilities. Kate loved him for it, even as she recognized it might make the eventual reality harder to bear. I need you to promise me something, she said. If the treatments become too difficult, if they're not working, if the side effects become worse than the disease itself, I need you to support my decision to stop, even if you disagree. The request hung between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to face fully. William's face went through several expressions before settling on reluctant understanding. I promise, he said quietly. But I also need you to promise to be honest about how you're feeling, about what you can and can't handle. No more protecting me from difficult truths. I promise, Kate replied. And this time she meant it completely. The hours between Kate's revelation and dinner time passed in a surreal blur of practical arrangements and emotional upheaval. William had immediately called Dr. Harrison, demanding a comprehensive consultation for the following morning and requesting names of other specialists who might offer different perspectives. His methodical approach to crisis management provided structure to a day that threatened to spiral into chaos. Kate found herself watching him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness as he worked through their new reality. He had transformed from shocked husband to determined advocate within hours, researching treatment centers and experimental therapies with the focused intensity he usually reserved for matters of state. It was exactly what she needed, but it also highlighted how much support she had denied herself by keeping the diagnosis secret. "The children will be home in an hour," Williams said, closing his laptop after a marathon session of medical research. "Are you ready for this conversation?" Kate felt her stomach clench with anxiety that had nothing to do with her illness. Telling William had been devastating, but necessary. Telling their children felt like destroying innocence that could never be restored. George, at 11, was old enough to understand the seriousness of cancer, while Charlotte and Louis would struggle to comprehend why their mother might not always be with them. "No," she said honestly. "But we can't wait any longer. Every day we delay makes it harder." William moved to sit beside her on the sofa in their private sitting room. They had chosen this space for the conversation because it was where they gathered most evenings as a family, where homework was completed and bedtime stories were read. The familiar surroundings might provide some comfort during what would certainly be the most difficult conversation of their children's lives. "We should tell them together," Williams said, taking her hand. "Present a united front so they understand we're handling this as a team." Kate nodded, though her throat felt too tight for words. She had rehearsed various versions of this conversation, trying to find language that would be honest but not terrifying, age-appropriate but not misleading. Every approach seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what they needed to communicate. The sound of cars in the courtyard announced the children's return from school. Kate listened to their familiar voices in the hallway. George discussing a football match, Charlotte describing an art project, Louis chattering about something that had happened at lunch. Their innocent happiness was about to be fundamentally altered. "Mummy, Daddy," Louis burst into the room with the boundless energy of a 6-year-old, throwing himself onto the sofa between his parents. "Mrs. Patterson says we can have a sleepover next weekend if you say it's okay." Charlotte and George followed more sedately, but both brightened when they saw their parents together in the middle of the afternoon. It was unusual for William to be home this early, and the children had learned to appreciate any unexpected family time. "Can we talk to you about something important?" Kate asked, her voice steadier than she felt. George's expression immediately became more serious. At 11, he had developed an acute sensitivity to adult moods and could sense when something was wrong. Charlotte and Louis were still young enough to assume that important might mean something exciting rather than devastating. "Are we getting a dog?" Charlotte asked hopefully. "Sophie at school just got a puppy, and it's the cutest thing ever." William managed a small smile despite the circumstances. "No, sweetheart. This is about something else. Come sit down, all of you." The children arranged themselves on the sofa and chairs opposite their parents, their faces showing varying degrees of curiosity and concern. Kate felt her heart breaking at their trust, their assumption that whatever news was coming, their parents would handle it and keep them safe. "You know how Mummy hasn't been feeling very well lately?" William began, his voice carefully controlled. George nodded slowly. "You've been tired a lot. And you missed my rugby match last week." Kate felt guilt stab through her at the reminder. She had promised to attend George's match, but had been too weak from treatment to make the trip. She had blamed a scheduling conflict, but George was perceptive enough to notice the pattern of her absences. "That's right," Kate said. "I have been tired, and I've had to miss some things that are important to you. The reason is that I've been sick, and I wanted to explain what's been happening." Charlotte's face immediately filled with concern. "Are you still sick now? Do you need medicine?" "I'm still sick, darling. I've been taking medicine, but this is the kind of illness that takes a very long time to get better." Kate paused, searching for words that would convey seriousness without causing panic. "It's called cancer." The word hung in the air like a stone dropping into still water. George's face went very pale as he processed the implications, while Charlotte and Louis looked confused but increasingly worried. "Cancer." George's voice cracked slightly. "But that's really serious, isn't it?" "It is serious," William confirmed gently. "That's why we wanted to talk to you about it. Mummy has been seeing special doctors who are working very hard to help her get better." Louis, who had been listening with the intense concentration of a child trying to understand adult concerns, raised his hand as if he were in school. "Will Mummy die?" The direct question hit both parents like a physical blow. Children's ability to cut through euphemism and address fundamental fears could be devastating in its clarity. Kate took a careful breath before answering. The doctors are doing everything they can to help me get better. But, yes, this is the kind of illness that can be very dangerous. That's why it's important for all of us to spend extra special time together. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. I don't want you to die, Mommy. Can't the doctors just give you medicine to make it go away? They're trying different medicines, Kate explained, her own voice beginning to shake. Some of them are working, but it's going to take time. And sometimes the medicines make me feel sick or tired, which is why I've had to cancel some things. George, who had been silent since learning the diagnosis, suddenly spoke up. Is that why you've looked so thin? And why you went to bed early last week when we were supposed to watch a film? Kate nodded, amazed and heartbroken by her oldest son's perceptiveness. He had been quietly cataloging changes in her appearance and behavior, probably worrying about them but not knowing how to ask. I should have explained sooner, she said. I didn't want you to worry, but I realized that not knowing was probably making you worry anyway. How long have you been sick? George asked. His voice was steady, but Kate could see he was fighting back tears. Since March, Kate admitted. I know that seems like a long time to keep it secret, but I needed time to understand what was happening before I could explain it to you. The children absorbed this information with varying degrees of comprehension. Louis was still struggling with the basic concept, while Charlotte had begun crying quietly. George looked angry, though Kate wasn't sure if his anger was directed at her secrecy, the illness itself, or the general unfairness of the situation. What happens now? George asked. Do you have to go to hospital? Will you be home for Christmas? The practical questions were easier to answer than the emotional ones. I'll be having more treatments, which means some days I might not feel very well. But I'll still be here, and we'll still do all the important things together. William reached over and pulled Charlotte onto his lap as her quiet crying became more pronounced. The most important thing for all of you to remember is that this doesn't change how much we love you. And we're going to make sure you're taken care of no matter what happens. Can we help? Charlotte asked through her tears. Can we do something to make you better? Kate felt her own composure beginning to crack at her daughter's earnest desire to fix something that was beyond anyone's control. You help just by being yourselves, she said. By giving me hugs, and telling me about your day, and letting me read you stories. That's the best medicine there is. Louis, who had been processing the conversation with intense concentration, suddenly climbed into Kate's lap and wrapped his arms around her neck. I'll give you extra hugs, he announced solemnly. Every day. The simple gesture nearly undid Kate completely. Her youngest son's instinctive response to devastating news was to offer comfort, to try to heal his mother through the power of childhood love. Will you lose your hair? Charlotte asked suddenly. My friend's grandmother had cancer, and she lost all her hair. Kate touched her hair self-consciously. It had already begun to thin from the chemotherapy, though she had been covering the changes with careful styling and strategic accessories. I might, she said honestly. Some of the medicines can cause that to happen. But if it does, we can get a beautiful wig, or I could wear scarves. Some people think bald heads look quite stylish. George managed a small smile at this. You'd look like Professor X from X-Men. He's brilliant, and he's bald. The comparison was so unexpected and sweet that both parents found themselves smiling despite the circumstances. Trust George to find a superhero comparison that made hair loss seem almost heroic. Will people at school find out? Charlotte asked. Will everyone know that Mummy is sick? This question highlighted another layer of complexity that Kate and William were still figuring out themselves. Their children's lives were already subject to media attention, and news of Kate's illness would intensify that scrutiny significantly. People will probably find out eventually, William said carefully. When that happens, there might be more photographers around or more questions from reporters. But your teachers and our security team will make sure you're protected. I don't want people to feel sorry for us, George said firmly. I don't want them to treat us differently because Mummy is sick. His mature response surprised both parents. At 11, George was already developing the instincts he would need as future heir to the throne, understanding that public sympathy could be as challenging as public criticism. That's understandable, Kate said. We'll try to keep things as normal as possible for as long as we can. But if anyone does treat you differently, you can always talk to us about it. The conversation continued for another hour, with the children asking increasingly specific questions about treatments, timelines, and what changes they might expect in their daily routines. William and Kate answered as honestly as they could while trying to maintain hope and stability. By the time they had covered all the immediate concerns, the children seemed emotionally exhausted but more settled. Having information, even difficult information, appeared to be less distressing than sensing that something was wrong without understanding what it was. "Can we still go to Balmoral for Christmas?" Lewis asked as the conversation was winding down. Kate felt William squeeze her hand at the question. Christmas at Balmoral was a cherished family tradition, but her treatment schedule might make travel difficult. "We're going to try very hard to make that happen," she said. "It might depend on how I'm feeling, but it's important to all of us." The children seemed satisfied with this response. They had grown up understanding that royal schedules were often subject to change due to circumstances beyond their control, and this didn't seem fundamentally different from other disruptions they had experienced. As bedtime approached, each child had individual moments with their parents. George, trying to be brave and mature, asked detailed questions about cancer survival rates until William gently redirected him toward more immediate concerns. Charlotte wanted reassurance that Kate would still be able to attend her school concert in December. Lewis simply wanted to know if he was allowed to tell people that his mummy was sick, and seemed relieved when told that it was okay to share with trusted friends. After the children were in bed, Kate and William sat in exhausted silence in their sitting room. The conversation had gone better than either had feared, but worse than they had hoped. The children had handled the news with remarkable maturity, but the weight of their sadness and fear was almost unbearable. "They're stronger than I expected," William said finally. "They're your children," Kate replied. "Of course they're strong." But even as they reassured each other about the children's resilience, both parents knew that the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead as the family adjusted to their new reality. The conversation was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge all of them in ways they had never imagined. The letter that had started everything still sat on Kate's desk, its pages now representing not just a confession, but the first step toward facing an uncertain future together as a family. 3 weeks after the devastating conversation that had shattered their carefully constructed normalcy, William found himself standing in the same palace corridor where his life had changed forever. But this time, the envelope in his hands was different, heavier somehow, marked with the formal seal of the London clinic and addressed to both of them. The experimental treatment that had offered their last hope had failed. Dr. Harrison had delivered the news with professional compassion, but the clinical language couldn't soften the brutal reality. Kate's condition had worsened significantly despite the aggressive intervention. The cancer had spread more rapidly than anyone had anticipated, and there were no more medical options to explore. Kate was resting in their bedroom, finally, allowing herself the luxury of staying in bed past noon without pretending it was a choice rather than a necessity. The pretense of maintaining normal routines had become impossible to sustain as her energy levels plummeted, and the side effects of treatment overwhelmed her diminishing reserves of strength. William had been holding the medical report for an hour, unable to bring himself to read the specific details. Some part of him believed that as long as the envelope remained sealed, the contents might somehow change, might reveal a mistake or overlooked option or miraculous reversal. But he knew Kate was waiting for him to share whatever news the report contained, and she deserved his honesty even when the truth was unbearable. He walked slowly toward their bedroom, each step feeling weighted with the accumulated grief of the past few weeks. The children were at school, unaware that their world was about to shift again. They had adjusted to their mother's illness with the resilience of youth, but this next phase would require different kinds of strength from all of them. Kate was sitting up in bed when he entered, wearing one of his oversized sweaters and looking smaller than he had ever seen her. Her hair had indeed begun falling out from the treatment, and she had finally given up trying to style it into something resembling her former appearance. The silk scarf she had taken to wearing gave her an exotic elegance, but couldn't hide how much weight she had lost. "Is that the report from Dr. Harrison?" she asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. William nodded, unable to trust his voice immediately. He sat on the edge of the bed and handed her the envelope, watching her face carefully as she opened it, and began reading. The clinical terminology was familiar to her now after months of medical consultations, and he could see the exact moment when she processed the implications. 6 weeks, she said quietly. Maybe 8 if I'm lucky. The timeline was shorter than either of them had feared, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that theoretical discussions couldn't match. 6 weeks to finish conversations that felt barely started, to create memories that would have to last the children's lifetimes, to say everything that needed to be said between a husband and wife facing the ultimate separation. Dr. Harrison wants to discuss palliative care options, William said when he could finally speak. Making sure you're comfortable, managing pain levels, maintaining quality of life for whatever time we have. Kate set the report aside and looked directly at him. No more hospitals unless it's absolutely necessary. I want to be here, in our home, with our family. Whatever happens, I want it to happen where we've been happiest. William felt something break inside his chest at the certainty in her voice. She had moved past hoping for recovery and was now focused on controlling the circumstances of her death. The transition from wife and mother to terminal patient was happening before his eyes, and he was powerless to stop it. The children, he said, because practical concerns were easier to address than emotional ones. We need to tell them about the timeline. They'll need time to process this. Kate nodded slowly. Tonight, after dinner. But, William, I don't want their last weeks with me to be consumed by grief and fear. I want them to remember me laughing with them, not just being sick. The request was both reasonable and impossible. How could any of them laugh or find joy when every moment was shadowed by countdown to loss? But William understood what she was asking for, a final gift to their children that would require enormous strength from both parents. What do you need from me? He asked. How do I help you through this? Kate reached for his hand with fingers that felt cold and fragile. I need you to promise me that you'll be okay afterward. Not immediately, but eventually. The children will need you to be their anchor, and you can't do that if you're drowning in grief. The promise felt impossible to make. William couldn't imagine a future without Kate, couldn't conceive of raising their children alone or fulfilling his royal duties without her steady presence beside him. She had become so integral to every aspect of his life that her absence would fundamentally alter who he was. I'll try, he said, because it was the only honest response he could give. There's something else, Kate continued, her voice growing softer. I want to write letters to the children, something they can have when they're older. And I want to record videos for important moments I'll miss, birthdays, graduations, weddings. The practical planning for her absence was devastating in its thoroughness, but William recognized the wisdom in it. Creating tangible connections to their future would give Kate some sense of continuing presence in their lives while providing the children with comfort during times when they missed her most acutely. We'll set up everything you need, he promised. Whatever you want to leave for them, we'll make it happen. Over the following days, Kate threw herself into the project of creating lasting gifts for her family with an energy that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her physical reserves. She spent hours writing letters for each child to open on future birthdays, recording videos for graduations and weddings that were still years away, compiling photo albums that told the story of their family's happiest moments. William found himself simultaneously amazed by her strength and heartbroken by its necessity. Watching her plan for a future she wouldn't see was both inspiring and devastating. She approached the task with the same meticulous attention to detail she had always brought to her royal duties. But this time the stakes were infinitely more personal. The children responded to the news of the shortened timeline with a maturity that both impressed and saddened their parents. George, now fully understanding the gravity of the situation, appointed himself as his mother's protector, helping her with small tasks and reading to her when she was too tired to focus on books herself. Charlotte threw herself into creating art projects that could serve as gifts, drawing pictures and writing poems with determined creativity. Louis, still young enough to believe in the power of love to solve any problem, rarely left Kate's side, as if his constant presence could somehow anchor her to life. The palace staff, informed of the situation's urgency, moved with quiet efficiency to accommodate whatever Kate needed. Her favorite flowers appeared in every room, meals were prepared according to her changing appetite and dietary restrictions, and the household schedule was adjusted to maximize family time while minimizing disruption. The media attention, once the diagnosis became public, was intense but respectful. The British public's genuine affection for Kate translated into an outpouring of support that both comforted and overwhelmed the family. Flowers, cards, and gifts arrived daily from around the world, expressions of love from people who had never met her but felt connected to her story. But it was the private moments that mattered most. Evening conversations when Kate shared stories from her childhood that the children had never heard. Quiet afternoons when she and William reminisced about their courtship and early marriage, remembering the shy university student who had captured the heart of a future king. Late-night planning sessions when they discussed practical arrangements for the children's care and William's continuing royal duties. One evening, about 4 weeks after receiving the final prognosis, Kate asked William to help her walk to their private garden. It was the same space where she had watched the children play countless times, where she had first felt well enough after each pregnancy to enjoy outdoor air, where so many important family moments had unfolded. "I want to see the stars," she said as they settled onto a bench that overlooked the climbing frame and oak trees. The November night was clear and cold, and Kate was bundled in heavy coats and blankets that made her look even more fragile. But her face was peaceful as she gazed upward, and William found himself memorizing her profile against the star-filled sky. "Do you think they'll remember this place?" she asked. "When they're grown, will they come here and think about family dinners and birthday parties and ordinary Tuesday afternoons?" "They'll remember everything," William said with complete certainty. "Every story you read, every game you played, every time you kissed a scraped knee or celebrated a good grade. You're woven into who they are." Kate smiled at this, the first genuinely happy expression he had seen from her in weeks. "I hope so. I hope when they think of me, they remember joy more than sadness." 3 days later, on a quiet Sunday morning while the children were having breakfast downstairs, Kate slipped away peacefully in her sleep. William woke to find her still and silent beside him, her face serene and untroubled, her hand still resting in his from the night before. The call to Dr. Harrison, the notification of staff, the careful orchestration of telling the children, all of it passed in a blur of necessary actions that felt disconnected from reality. William moved through the practical requirements of death, while some part of his mind refused to accept what had happened. It was George who brought him back to the present moment. Standing in the palace hallway outside Kate's study, still wearing his pajamas, the 11-year-old looked up at his father with eyes full of tears, but also unexpected strength. "Daddy," he said quietly, "Mummy's not in pain anymore, is she?" The simple question, asked with such mature understanding, finally broke through William's shock. He knelt in the corridor and pulled his son into his arms, both of them crying now for the first time since Kate's death. "No," William whispered into George's hair. "She's not in pain anymore." And, in that moment, collapsing to his knees in the palace hallway with his grieving son, William finally began to understand what Kate had meant about finding a way to be okay afterward. It wouldn't happen immediately, and it wouldn't erase the devastating loss, but for the children's sake and in honor of the love they had shared, he would find a way to carry on. The letter that had started their final journey together still sat in Kate's desk drawer, its pages now representing not just a confession, but a testament to love strong enough to face impossible circumstances with grace and courage. It would remain there, a private reminder of the moment when everything changed and the beginning of learning how to say goodbye.